Hello, my name is Riley Mathis, and today I'll be talking about climate change. First, I'm going to start off by giving you a brief overview of what this presentation will actually entail. I'm going to begin speaking about the history of climate change. This will include how far back we see documented instances of climate change and what could have contributed to that. I will then move into the types of climate change we see currently and why those forms exist. Then I'll move more into climate change and how it can affect us humans and the environment. And then I'll conclude with speaking about the ways we can tackle climate change and curb the effects of climate change for future generations. And I truly hope you enjoy this presentation. Before I dive fully into content, I wanted to explain why I care about this subject. Climate change is something that a lot of people don't want to believe in. It's frustrating to see people blatantly ignoring the obvious effects climate change has on not only our society, but also the world we live in. Refusing to acknowledge our contributions to climate change is reckless. If humans cannot take accountability for our actions, then the future generations will suffer because of us. I wanted to investigate the subject of climate change to become better well versed in this subject. I wanted to be able to tell everyone I know the facts surrounding climate change and the ways we can reduce our contributions to things like air pollution. I am not by any means saying that I'm a perfect human and that I don't contribute to any form of pollution, but I do want to be a better advocate to save our planet. Before I get too far into this presentation, I wanted to look at a definition of climate change. There's a bunch out there, but I liked how NASA defined it. They defined it as a climate change is a long-term change in the average weather patterns that have come to define Earth's local, regional, and global climates. These changes have a broad range of observed effects, and they are synonymous with the term. This is a definition of climate change that I will keep in mind throughout the presentation. I hope this brief discussion of climate change gives you a better idea of what we're going to be talking about. So now let's begin. We have now entered the first portion of the presentation, the history of climate change. So in this slide, I'm going to be talking mainly about carbon dioxide levels and global sea levels here on Earth. So for reference, carbon dioxide is a huge contributor to the shifting of the Earth's temperature. Our Earth periodically went through phases of having higher and lower levels of carbon dioxide. As you can see in this figure, we had never seen carbon dioxide levels go over 300 parts per million until 1911. So you can see those waxing and waning phases of having lower and higher levels of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. And the rise in 1911 is important to note because at the beginning of the 1900s is when we saw the second industrial revolution begin. This shows that the increased use of things like fossil fuels finally started to affect our atmosphere in the early 1900s. Researchers were noting other forms of climate prior to 1911. A team of scientists ventured into the seas in 1863 and noticed that sea levels had begun to rise. They attributed this to the first industrial revolution. You can see that in the graphic on the right that sea levels have dramatically increased ever since 1880, when it became more documented. These instances showed that climate change began to occur when humans started filling the air with pollutants, and that scientists started to record this evidence earlier than we may have thought. Let's look into some major climate change discoveries prior to the 21st century. In 1938, a scientist named Guy Callendar noticed through his work that global temperatures had risen 0.3 degrees Celsius over the past 50 years. This was the first time somebody had documented the Earth's temperatures and discovered the increase. Then in 1958, a man named Dr. Charles David Keeling was the first one to measure rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere and attribute those to fossil fuels. This helped put the idea of climate change into the heads of those living in the 21st century. In 1967, researchers Tukuto Manabe and Richard Weatherald produced the first model of the Earth's climate. This allowed for other researchers to adjust the CO2 levels and then see how that would impact the global temperatures. In 1968, Dr. John Mercer began to warn the public about global warming causing the ice sheets to collapse, resulting in a rise in sea levels. This is when we first started to see the topic of glaciers pulled into the topic of climate change. In 1969, the Nimbus 3 satellite provided the first accurate measurement of global atmospheric temperatures. This satellite produced much more accurate data compared to the temperatures recorded by hand in 1938. Lastly, in 1985, a group of scientists found through their research that there was a hole in the ozone layer above Antarctica. This led to a complete ban of certain chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons, which helped raise awareness of climate change in the late 20th century. Now, those were just a couple ways of the couple of the major discoveries regarding climate change. There are obviously many other ways climate change could be seen in the past, but I don't have the time to talk about all of them. So now that I gave you a brief history of what we had seen before the 21st century in regards to climate change, we're now going to move into the types of climate change and why they actually exist. I've already previously discussed some of the ways our climate has changed, but I'll go further into depth about this topic now. Some of the recent ways we've seen our climate change include CO2 levels, sea levels, melting glaciers, ocean acidification, and surface temperatures. CO2 levels have been rising ever since the 19th century. In 2023, the global average atmospheric carbon level sat at 419.3 parts per million, which is a record high amount. The average growth rate of atmospheric carbon has tripled over the past century. The rate of increase in the atmospheric CO2 has happened around 200 times faster than the natural increases that we've observed. Looking at sea levels, we obviously know they're increasing. Since 1880, they have risen 8 to 9 inches globally. In 2023, we set again a new climate change record. Our global average sea level set that record by being at 101.4 millimeters above the sea level reported in 1993. The rate in which sea levels rise has been increasing as well, as we sit about 14 inches or 3.6 millimeter increase per year. What makes this issue even worse is that sea level rises are not the same across the globe. Some coastal areas in the US are more susceptible to sea level rises compared to other areas. Now, why do we see these sea levels rising? Well, that would be because of the melting ice sheets and glaciers. Antarctica has lost 150 billion tons of ice mass, and Greenland has lost 270 billion tons per year. Both of these masses store 2/3 of Earth's fresh water, and now billions of tons of water is merging with salt water, and that becomes unusable for humans and animals. Another effect we see within our oceans would be ocean acidification. This is essentially where the pH levels of the ocean decrease because of absorption of CO2. The pH of the surface of the oceans has increased by 0.1 pH units, which may not sound like a lot, but that actually represents approximately a 30% increase in acidity. This increase impacts animals that cannot tolerate acidic conditions. The final change in climate we will discuss is a change in surface temperature. Obviously, we know the temperature of the Earth has been increasing for a while now, like we discussed earlier, and since 1850, the Earth's temperature has risen 2 degrees Fahrenheit. It may not seem like a lot, but we've seen a lot of various observable effects that we'll discuss later. Since 1982, the rate in which scientists have observed this warming has been 3 times faster per decade. In 2023, we again set a record of having the warmest year since 1850. The 10 warmest years have all occurred within the past 10 years. So, there are ways our global climate is slowly changing. It contributes to the negative environment and human health effects that we see today. So next, we're going to look at the reason why we see these changes. Next, I will discuss why climate change has occurred. The baseline is that humans are the number one instigator of climate change. I feel like that makes sense. Humans and human products, and some farm animals, are actually the reason for a majority of the contributors to climate change. Humans have a tendency to put dangerous chemicals in the air, and I'm going to cover a majority of the ways humans have caused climate change to happen. This cycle of damaging our Earth started during the Industrial Revolutions, which occurred all over the world, and it hasn't stopped since then. Some of the big contributors of climate change we see include generating energy, manufacturing and industrial processes, the mass cutting down of trees, and food production. These are processes that are done with large amounts of money, and many people contribute to them indirectly. Generating energy includes processes like burning fossil fuels for electricity or heat. Some of the fossil fuels burned include forms of oil, gas, and coal. These all lead to increased amounts of carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide in the atmosphere. These chemicals help form the greenhouse gases that trap the sun's heat here on Earth, hence why we see surface temperatures getting warmer here. We mainly see these processes occur within large industries and oil companies, so places like Saudi Aramco, Chevron, ExxonMobil, the National Iranian Oil Company, BP, and plenty more. The 3 biggest consumers of fossil fuels include China, the United States, and India, all the places with the biggest populations. As of 2023, we consume 40,102 terawatts of gas. 54,564 terawatt hours of oil, and 54,565 terawatts of coal globally. That's a lot. You can see that we consume large amounts of fossil fuels throughout companies generating energy. Manufacturing and industrial processes cross over with fossil fuel use quite a lot. Manufacturing items for consumer use produces tons of emissions each year. These items could include things like plastics, electronics, iron, steel, clothes, and plenty of other materials that we create. Industries have machines that can contribute to global emissions as well. It's been said that the manufacturing industry is one of the largest contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. Cutting down huge amounts of trees or forests is also detrimental to the earth. Groups do this to create more room for development: farms, pastures, commercial properties, and residential properties. Cutting down trees reduces the amount of oxygen put into the atmosphere and decreases the amount of carbon dioxide absorbed from the atmosphere. When you have less trees on Earth, you also see a decrease in habitats for animals and soil erosion. The loss of forests is responsible for around 10% of global warming. The mass production of food is another contributor to climate change that we see. There are many steps in the process of creating, farming, packaging, selling, distributing, and consuming food. The various gases we see produced during these processes include methane, nitrous oxide, carbon dioxide, and plenty other emissions. These processes include the cattle's digestion processes, use of fertilizers, cutting down forests for farmland, burning crops, fuel use, manure management, and rice cultivation. Because of all of this, the production and cultivation of food and livestock creates the largest chunk of food-related greenhouse gas emissions. So in the next slide, I'm going to discuss more singular ways we contribute to climate change, so less big company and more individual processes. We humans contribute to all big forms of climate change that I discussed in the previous slides, but there are ways that we individually contribute within our own home or neighborhood. So sitting idly in your car when at like a fast food drive-through or at the school pickup line increases the amount of greenhouse gases created by your car. When at home, keeping the lights on or keeping electronics plugged in at all times creates more energy use, which contributes to climate change. When humans buy meat, vegetables, or fruits from a grocery store and not local farms, it creates more waste and more fuel for the food industry. Burning trash is also something that puts toxic chemicals into our atmosphere. Driving cars and living in homes whose main energy source is a fossil fuel also contributes to greenhouse gas emissions daily. There are many things that us humans do that contribute to global warming every day. And it's hard to notice that some of our daily actions can have such an impact on our environment, especially when it's hard or expensive to find an alternative way to live. In the next section, we're going to talk about climate change effects on humans and the environment. We have now moved on to the third section, so let's discuss how all of this affects our health. There are various observable effects of climate change. We can break these down into four main categories, which would be more dangerous weather, displacement, extinction, and poor human health. Bad weather occurs year-round and all over the globe. When bad weather hits, it can cost countries millions to billions to repair itself. When looking at dangerous weather, scientists have documented higher frequencies of poor weather occurring. Hurricanes, tropical storms, and cyclone intensities have all increased over the past 30 to 40 years. Looking at the graph I've pulled up on the slide here to the top left, you can see how the number of hurricanes started off pretty high back when data collection might have been poor or where they didn't have classification for hurricanes quite yet. Then it dropped in the 1920s to 1930s, then it steadily increased up until present day. This shows an uptick in the amount of extreme weather we observe in our oceans, coupled with a rise in global warming and ocean acidification. If we continue to focus on our oceans, you will notice that there has been an increase in the amount of marine heat waves. Now, these are just long periods of time where the ocean has high surface temperatures. This is not good for sea life, as they're not used to such high temperatures. The ocean feeling just a little bit warm doesn't just affect what's in the ocean. If local sea life is affected, this could also affect local towns or cities that rely on catching fish, clams, or other sea life for their income. Looking at the graph on the bottom right, you can see that over the years there's a trend where the amount of these heat waves has increased. Moving back on land, Wildfires have been another big issue here in the US. Climate change has caused for some areas to be extra dry and others to be more humid than normal. For the US, it has caused areas that are typically dry to become even drier, allowing fires to ignite more easily and wildfires to spread quicker. The NOAA found that a 2016 study said that climate change enhanced the drying organic matter and doubled the number of large fires between 1984 and 2015. That's a crazy statistic to think about. And now on the bottom left, you'll see a statistic here that talks about the number of wildfires in the US, and you can see how they're steadily increasing. If we look at the opposite of droughts and wildfires, you will also see that precipitation levels have increased in some areas because of climate change. Looking at the graph on the top right corner, you will see that precipitation levels have steadily been increasing over the years in the US. NASA has determined that because of the rising temperatures we experience now because of climate change, it has intensified the Earth's water cycle, increasing the evaporation stage. This leads to more intense storms where we see this increased amount of precipitation. More water being in our rain cycle does not just contribute to things like heavy storms and hurricanes, but it can also increase the danger behind flooding. Flooding can wipe out homes or even towns. NASA did find that areas that are more prone to storms are now even more prone to the risk of flooding due to climate change. Looking at all the ways climate change affects our weather is insane to me. I personally feel like people do not associate the increased intensity of our storms with climate change. This causes people to not understand the true magnitude of climate change. In the next slide, I will go over another way climate change personally affects all of us. And before I get to that next way, I did want to briefly discuss this graph that I found. So this image I used may not be the clearest, but it still conveys the message I want to talk about. As I mentioned in the previous slide, the amount of dangerous weather that the world has experienced has increased. And if we look at the US specifically, you can see just how much money this costs us. An increased amount of dangerous weather costs us billions of dollars every year. Climate change has not only created these dangerous storms and disasters to occur more often, but it's forced the US government to spend more money on repairing our nation after these events occur. I feel like seeing these numbers on a graph puts into perspective just how much climate change truly affects us, not only physically, psychologically, but economically. Now I'll be speaking about displacement. Now, what actually is displacement, you may ask? Well, according to the European Union, they describe it as, in a global context, as the movement of persons who have been forced or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of or in order to avoid the effects of armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, violations of human rights, or natural or human-made disasters. We are going to focus on the natural or human-made disaster section. Climate change has forced individuals out of their homes in some areas of the world. If we think about America, there are plenty of times where people have had to evacuate their homes because of natural disasters or extreme weather events that are exacerbated by climate change. There are even times where constant fights with extreme weather have eradicated homes and forced individuals just to live somewhere else. If we look globally, those who are internally displaced or a refugee tend to live in informal settlements or camps which are extremely vulnerable to climate hazards. There is also a new term being used to describe those displaced by climate change: climate refugees. A lot of these refugees tend to be affected by things like droughts or flooding. People residing in the Gobi deserts of China and the Horn of Africa are now having to migrate to other areas because of how stricken with drought these areas are. Somalia in particular has had 1.3 million people become displaced because of the famine that was brought with the drought. There are other examples of these climate refugees all around the world. I never knew that there were instances of people being forced out of their homes because of the severity of climate change. And it's so sad that areas of the earth are becoming more and more inhabitable because of our ways of living. So if we look at the picture on the left, these are two people that were forced to look at the aftermath of a hurricane, seeing all the homes that have been destroyed and knowing they're going to have to find somewhere else to live. And then on the right is a picture of people migrating and moving somewhere else where they originally lived in Somalia but could no longer live there because of the drought and the famine that was widespread. And in the next slide, I'm going to be focusing more on extinction. I feel like a lot of people know that extinction within animal species and plant species is a problem, but I don't know that people understand what aspects of climate change actually impact animals and plants. Around 1 million animal and plant species are predicted to face extinction because of climate change. The main abiotic or non living things that we see impacting animals is a change of temperature, precipitation, and other factors. A lot of animals are cold blooded, meaning they don't produce their own body heat and must rely on the external temperature and factors to give it heat. If there are increased periods of heat or extreme cold, these cold blooded animals may die sooner because their bodies aren't used to regulating those types of temperatures. An increased surface temperature can also disrupt breeding activities. Decreased precipitation can cause animal species to be without water, food, and a suitable habitat, killing them. Too much precipitation can wipe habitats off the face of the earth, also contributing to their extinction. Some other abiotic factors that contribute to extinction include increased fire frequency, melting ice caps, rising sea levels, and the salinification of fresh water. There are also some biotic factors that can affect Earth's animals. There can be negative impacts on beneficial species and positive impacts on harmful species. This can mean a decrease in the prey for predators or parasites for hosts. A decreased amount of local wildlife can also affect certain species. This could also mean more predators roam and more invasive plant species can take root. These are both negative patterns that can affect our survival. The main animals that we see being plagued with extinction or endangerment include North Atlantic whales, coral, green sea turtles, polar bears, Adelie penguins, bumblebees, Asian elephants, orangutans, black rhinos, and there's so many more. It's sad to see that all of these innocent animals are dying passively at our hands. Now, looking at the pictures on these PowerPoints, on the left you're going to see an image of an extinct lycophyte that used to reside in Pennsylvania, actually. Clearly, we don't see this type of tree anymore. It looks very cool, but we just don't have those anymore. And then on the image in the middle, it's going to just show some animals that I may or may not have listed that are endangered, and these are just the most endangered animals we see here on Earth. And then on the very right, you're going to see animals that have already been driven to extinction, so they no longer exist here on Earth anymore, unfortunately. And I hope in the future that we can help rebuild the animal kingdom that we have broken. People know climate change can be bad, but how can it actually affect our health? Well, since there are so many components that can contribute to climate change, it can affect our health in various ways. Air pollution is a huge component of climate change. It can include things like smog and particulate matter in the air. Breathing these toxic chemicals in can decrease lung function, increase hospital visits, and increase rates seen for asthma, and an increase in premature deaths. A lot of people also experience allergies year round, and even this can be affected by climate change. It can affect how much pollen we are exposed to, how much of these experienced symptoms we see, and how much pollen can affect our health, and the times of year we see pollen. And as I talked about earlier, we know temperature and precipitation changes have not been great for the Earth this far, and humans don't seem to fare any better. The increased amount of heat waves has increased the number of heat-related illnesses and deaths. An increased amount of precipitation brings heavy rain and flooding, and this could wipe out homes, killing people. Food and waterborne diseases can also spread during times of heavy precipitation and humid air, affecting the health of humans as well. A lack of precipitation can be deadly. It can lead to wildfires, extreme heat, degraded water quality, and a reduced water quality, which all poorly affect humans. When things like a change in precipitation happen, it can affect global food yields. It has already been predicted that livestock and fish productions will decline. This will spike prices and cause a lot of people to not be able to afford the food they normally need. People will go hungry. When watching all of this happen, it can affect our mental health as well. Experiencing stress from extreme weather linked to climate change can cause preterm births, low birth weight, or maternal complications. The last thing I wanted to look at that affects human health is vector-borne diseases. These are diseases caused by things like mosquitoes, ticks, or fleas. If climate change alters our environment in favor of these vectors, we could see an increase in the rates of the following diseases: Lyme disease, dengue fever, West Nile virus, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, plague, and tularemia. You can clearly see how climate change has impacted various aspects of our health. Now, I want to look at the the image on the slide here. So I really like how this image encapsulates every single part of climate change that affects our health. You can see how air pollution causes respiratory illnesses, and that poor water quality can lead to gastrointestinal issues. And I really like that in the middle is this cycle that just never seems to end. You can see that climate change really contributes to this cycle. And this cycle seems like it'll just never end. But after this, now we're on our final section of the PowerPoint. We have now entered the final section of this presentation, the ways we can tackle climate change. Personally, I quite like this section because it feels empowering. There's so many things we can do within our own homes and communities that lessen our contribution to climate change. If you have children, like to get food often, or go to drive-through coffee shops, consider turning your car off in the drive-through line instead of sitting idly. Leaving your car on for extended periods of time when you're not actually using it helps contribute to the amount of fossil fuels in the atmosphere. Could also be applied to times where you just sit in your car. Staying in the realm of cars, you could also choose to utilize other forms of transportation. This includes public transportation, riding a bike, walking, or carpooling with other people. All of these options also help to reduce carbon emissions released from driving a car. Something else you may not think about releasing chemicals is burning your trash. This action can release all sorts of chemicals in the air, so it's best to just refrain. Something you can do physically in your home is reducing the amount of energy you consume. This can include unplugging devices at night, turning off all lights when you're not using them, switching to LED light bulbs and energy-efficient appliances, or hanging things out to dry. If you're unable to do so, or if you are able to do so, you could even ask your utility company if you could switch to using renewable energy, such as wind or solar. Obviously, this is not an option for everybody to do, but if you can do it, I highly suggest it. Something else that is helpful within the home is recycling and reusing. If you buy reusable items instead of disposable ones, then you can reduce the amount of waste you create. Recycling also helps reduce how much trash actually ends up in landfills. Another lifestyle change that promotes a cleaner earth involves the process of eating more vegetables and less meat. As we talked about earlier, the cattle industry contributes to a huge amount of greenhouse gas emissions. So if we reduce the amount of money put into that industry, you could also, by going vegetarian or semi-vegetarian, you could also help reduce those emissions. You could also help plant native trees and other plant species around your home or community. This helps promote the production of oxygen and the absorption of carbon dioxide from our atmosphere. Something else that is small and easy to do is just to clean up your environment or where you live. Go volunteer. Clean up some trash after a big event in your town so the trash doesn't end up in waste treatment centers or water treatment centers. The last thing I can advise for you to do is speak up. Let everyone around you know about climate change, its effects, and all the ways we can create a better life and a better earth. There are, of course, still other ways you can reduce your contribution to climate change, but if I speak about all of them, I may take all day. The last thing I have to say is that I don't want anyone to feel any shame about not being able to genuinely make big commitments or big changes regarding your greenhouse gas emissions. Some of these options are just not feasible for everybody, and that's entirely okay. You can just become the ultimate spokesperson for climate change. Now, all this talk may make you feel gloomy. Is all humankind forgetting that we only have one Earth? Luckily, the answer to that is no. There are some ways that the U.S. government is attempting to reduce the impacts of climate change. The U.S. Department of State intends to utilize $1.7 trillion to invest in some clean forms of energy, like solar and wind. They have also decided to roll out tax credits as a part of the Inflation Reduction Act to encourage people to use clean energy. Some gas companies are also trying to make a change. BP highly encourages the use of carbon capture and storage and hydrogen in the U.S. to reduce the amount of greenhouse gases emitted. Using both of these would drastically cut CO2 emissions, which is obviously necessary. If we look at the global scale, you will have probably heard about something called the Paris Agreement. In 2015, this document was created to attack climate change. The main goal is to hold the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial level. This committee creates nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies to commit to reducing their greenhouse gas emissions. This is an extremely powerful group to have been formed. They hold the most power against big oil and countries who refuse to commit to lowering their contribution to climate change. I think it's nice to see that some people do care about the well-being of our Earth. and I hope that in the future we start to see more about how we are reducing our contributions. Thank you so much for watching. I had a blast researching climate change and everything to do with it, and I learned so much from being able to do this, and I hoped you actually ended up learning something from me. So thanks again. And just a little credit, all of these slides were from SlidesGo, and I hope it made the presentation more entertaining to watch.